At 0847 hours on October 24, 1943, Major Frank Morrison crouched beside the left boom of a P-38 Lightning at Nadzab airfield in New Guinea, holding 2 wooden matches in his grease-stained hands, while his 4 pilots watched him explain something that would either save their lives or get them all court-martialed in the next 6 hours. The problem was simple and brutal. 18 Mitsubishi A-6M0 fighters were inbound from Wewak, and Morrison's 4 P-38 seconds were the only thing standing between those zeros and a supply convoy carrying ammunition and medical supplies for 5,000 American troops holding the line at Finschhafen. The math was nightmare fuel. 18 zeros, 4 lightnings. The zeros could outturn any American fighter at low altitude. They'd been doing it for 2 years. They'd killed 147 P-38 pilots in the Southwest Pacific since January, and Morrison's squadron had lost 6 pilots in the past 3 weeks, all caught in turning fights they couldn't escape. The tropical morning air was thick with humidity and the smell of aviation fuel. Sweat ran down Morrison's face, staining the collar of his flight suit. Around them, ground crews worked frantically to fuel and arm the 4 P-38 seconds. The sound of fuel pumps and ammunition belts being loaded into wing bays created a constant mechanical rhythm. Morrison could hear his own heartbeat in his ears, could feel the weight of 4 lives resting on whether this crazy idea would actually work in combat. But Morrison had figured something out. Something nobody in 5th Air Force Command would believe. Something that combined a mechanic's unauthorized wire modification with a tactical formation that violated every doctrine in the Army Air Force manual. He'd spent the past month testing it, refining it, watching it work in small engagements, and now he was about to bet 4 pilots' lives on 2 matches and a piece of piano wire. Morrison held the matches up for his pilots to see. Lieutenant Robert Hayes, 23 years old, farm kid from Iowa, sun-weathered face, hands that had worked cornfields before they worked control sticks. Lieutenant James Chen, 24, Sacramento, engineering mind, methodical, always thinking 3 steps ahead. Captain William Torres, 27, flight leader from Texas. Experienced, confident, but Morrison could see the doubt in his eyes now. And Lieutenant David Parker, 22, Boston, smart kid, quick reflexes, scared but trying not to show it. All of them good pilots, all of them scared, all of them looking at Morrison like he'd lost his mind. "This is how we're gonna survive today," Morrison said, moving the matches in a weaving pattern. "Watch how they cross, watch how they protect each other." Now imagine each match is a P-38 with controls that respond half a second faster than normal. Hayes interrupted, his Iowa drawl cutting through the morning heat. "Sir, the P-38 can't respond that fast. The control cables have too much slack. We've all felt it. Every one of us has felt that delay when we need the aircraft to move right now, and it takes that extra split second to respond." Morrison smiled. It wasn't a happy smile. It was the smile of a man who'd watched too many friends die and finally found a way to stop the bleeding. "Not anymore," he said. "Technical Sergeant McKenna spent last night modifying all 4 aircraft. Your controls are going to respond like nothing you've experienced. And when we combine that with this formation," he crossed the matches again, "we're going to make those zeros wish they'd stayed home." Parker spoke up, his Boston accent cutting through the tropical heat. "Major, if we're flying modified aircraft with unauthorized tactical formations and this goes sideways, they're going to hang us all. I mean every last one of us. Court-martial, dishonorable discharge, the whole 9 yards." Morrison looked at each pilot in turn, saw the fear in their eyes, saw the doubt, saw young men who'd already watched their friends get shot down because doctrine said they couldn't turn with zeros, and physics said their aircraft responded too slowly to escape. He saw himself in them. The same fear he'd felt when Chen died. The same rage at watching good men die while following rules that didn't work. "You're right," Morrison said, his voice steady. "If this fails, I'll take the blame. I'll tell command I ordered the modifications without your knowledge. I'll tell them I forced you to fly the formation. I'll sign whatever paperwork they need to clear your names. But if it works, gentlemen, we're going to change how every P-38 inches the Pacific Theater flies. We're going to stop losing pilots to an enemy that's been beating us on maneuverability for 2 damn years. He checked his watch. 0851 hours. The Zeros would be at intercept point in 47 minutes. Mount up, Morrison ordered. And trust the formation. Trust the modification. Trust each other. That's all we've called God today. Trust. What none of them knew was that in the next 98 minutes, they'd prove that innovation in combat doesn't come from engineering committees or tactical manuals. It comes from commanders desperate enough to break every rule and mechanics brave enough to help them do it. Let me back up and tell you how Morrison figured this out, because the story starts 3 months earlier with a dead pilot and a piece of piano wire. July 9th, 1943. Lieutenant Commander David Chen took off from Dobodura at 0615 hours on a fighter sweep over Leh, 24 years old, engineering degree from Berkeley, 3 weeks in theater. Morrison had been his flight leader. They'd talked about California the night before. Chen wanted to open a garage after the war, work on cars instead of fighting Zeros. Maybe import some of those European racing designs. Maybe build something new. He had dreams, plans, a future that extended beyond this jungle airfield and the daily death lottery of aerial combat. Chen never got that garage. His flight intercepted 4 Zeros at 14,000 feet. Standard bounce. Dive from altitude. Use speed. Get guns on target. Climb back out. Hit and run. That's what doctrine said. That's what kept P-38 pilots alive. It was the only way to fight an enemy that could outturn you. Speed and altitude. Those were the P-38's advantages. Never get caught in a turning fight. Never let the Zero use its maneuverability. Except, Chen's wingman got separated during the initial dive. 2 Zeros reversed on Chen, got inside his turn radius. Chen tried to roll out and run, but Morrison heard him on the radio saying his controls felt mushy, like there was a delay between stick movement and aircraft response. His voice was calm at first, professional, then urgent, then desperate. The Zeros stayed with him through the dive, shot him down at 4,000 feet. Morrison watched it happen from 8,000 feet above. Watched Chen's P-38 trailing smoke. Watched it hit the jungle canopy. Watched a good man die because his airplane couldn't respond fast enough. Watched the smoke rising from the crash site. Knew there'd be no rescue. Knew Chen was gone before he hit the trees. Morrison's hands were shaking on his control stick. Rage and grief mixed together until he couldn't tell which was which. He wanted to dive on those Zeros. Wanted to kill them both, but his fuel was low and there were 2 more Zeros above him. He climbed away, headed back to Dobodura, and tried to figure out how to tell Chen's family that their son died following orders perfectly. The official report said pilot error. Said Chen should have maintained situational awareness, should have kept his wingman close, should have followed doctrine more precisely. Said if he just stuck to the plan, stayed with his element, used his speed advantage, he'd still be alive. Morrison read that report and wanted to put his fist through a wall, because he'd felt that same mushy control response a dozen times. Every P-38 pilot had. That slight delay when you move the stick hard and fast. That fraction of a second where the aircraft seemed to think about your input before responding. At high speeds, it didn't matter. The aircraft had momentum. The controls had leverage. But at low speeds during hard maneuvering, that delay was the difference between living and dying. Morrison went to the maintenance area that evening, found Technical Sergeant McKenna working on Chen's aircraft. They'd pulled it from the depot for inspection. McKenna was in his 30s, old for an enlisted man. He'd been a mechanic before the war, worked on everything from Model Ts to racing planes. He had grease permanently embedded under his fingernails, and the kind of hands that understood machines better than most engineers. The kind of hands that could feel what was wrong just by touching metal. What killed him? Morrison asked. McKenna looked up from the wing he was inspecting. His face was weathered, lined with the stress of maintaining aircraft in a combat zone, where every inspection might reveal the flaw that kills the next pilot. Nothing mechanical, sir. Engine was perfect. Control surfaces were aligned. Cable tensions were within spec. Within spec, Morrison repeated, but not tight. McKenna paused, set down his wrench, looked at Morrison like he was trying to decide something important, like he was weighing whether to speak the truth or protect his career. Sir, can I speak freely? Always. The cables have slack. Not much. Maybe 3/8 of an inch at full deflection. Factory tolerances allow it. Engineering says it's acceptable. But I've worked on aircraft for 15 years, and I'm telling you, that slack kills people. I can feel it every time I check the controls. That little bit of play, that tiny delay. It's there in every P-38 that comes through here. Morrison felt something click in his brain. How much slack? Enough to create. Maybe a quarter-second delay in control response. Maybe half a second in hard maneuvering when the cable's under maximum load and the pilot's pulling 4 or 5 Gs. That's when the slack really matters, when you need instant response and the aircraft takes that extra fraction of a second to catch up. Can it be fixed? McKenna wiped his hands on his coveralls. The fabric was so stained with oil and grease that Morrison couldn't tell what color it had originally been. Officially? No. Would require engineering approval from Lockheed. They're 7,000 miles away in California. Probably take 6 months to evaluate and another 6 to implement. Maybe a year. Maybe never. Unofficially, he looked around the maintenance area. Nobody else was close enough to hear. I could tension the cables tighter, eliminate most of that slack. Would take me about 20 minutes per aircraft. But it's not approved, not tested, and if something went wrong, I'd face a court-martial. Morrison thought about Chen, thought about the 5 other pilots they'd lost in the past 2 months, thought about Lieutenant Thomas Baker, who died 3 weeks ago over Leh, thought about Captain William Reynolds, who died 2 weeks before that over Wewak, all killed in turning fights, all killed because their aircraft couldn't respond fast enough. Thought about the official reports that blamed pilot error when he knew damn well the problem was mechanical. What would you need? Morrison asked. Permission, sir, in writing. So when this blows up, you can show command that you ordered it. You're not going to get permission in writing, Sergeant, because I'm not asking permission. But if you can make these aircraft respond faster, I want you to do it to every P-38 inches my flight. McKenna studied Morrison's face. You understand what you're asking me to do? I'd be modifying flight-critical systems without authorization, using non-standard parts. If a cable snaps during flight because of my modification, that pilot dies, and we both go to prison. Leavenworth, maybe worse. And if you don't do it, pilots keep dying because their aircraft can't turn with zeros. I'd rather face a court-martial than write another letter to another mother explaining how her son followed doctrine perfectly and got killed anyway. I'm tired of writing those letters, Sergeant. I'm tired of watching good men die because the engineering manual says 3/8 of an inch of slack is acceptable. McKenna was quiet for a long moment. Morrison could see him weighing the decision. Career versus conscience, regulations versus results, safety versus survival. Then he nodded. All right, sir, but we do this my way. Piano wire tensioners? High tensile wire bent into a Z shape, installed as an inline tensioner on the aileron control cables, adds 0.4 pounds of tension, eliminates the slack completely, takes about 8 minutes per aircraft if nobody's watching. How soon can you start? Tonight. After inspection, crew goes off duty. I'll do yours first. You test it tomorrow, and if it works the way I think it will, I'll do the rest of your flight. Morrison shook McKenna's hand. If this works, Sergeant, I owe you a bottle of whatever you drink. If this works, sir, you owe me nothing. Just bring your pilots home alive. That night, while Morrison lay in his bunk trying to sleep, McKenna worked alone in the maintenance hangar. The tropical night was humid and still. The only sounds were distant generators and insects buzzing against overhead lights. The air smelled like engine oil and hot metal, and the sweet decay of the jungle surrounding the airfield. McKenna pulled the inspection panel off Morrison's P-38's left boom. Inside, the aileron control cable ran through a series of pulleys toward the tail section. He grabbed the cable with both hands and pulled, felt the slack, maybe 3/8 of an inch of play before the tension caught. He'd felt that slack 100 times during routine maintenance. Had thought about it every time a pilot died. Had known for months that this was killing people. Had lain awake at night doing the math in his head. Quarter-second delay times 60 pilots times 12 missions. How many men had died because of 3/8 of an inch of slack? The piano wire came from a salvaged P-38 that had ground-looped 2 weeks earlier. McKenna kept a collection of useful parts from scrapped aircraft. You never knew when you'd need something in a combat zone where supply lines were measured in months instead of days. He'd learned that lesson maintaining aircraft in the Philippines before the war. Before Pearl Harbor, before everything changed, he sat on the hangar floor with the wire and a pair of pliers, bent it into a Z shape. The wire was stiff, fought back against the pliers. His hand slipped twice, cut his thumb on the second try. Blood made the wire slippery. He wiped it on his coveralls and kept working. The pain didn't matter. Nothing mattered except getting this right. 8 minutes to get the bend right. The Z shape would act as an inline tensioner, would add just enough preload to eliminate the slack without overstressing the cable. McKenna had calculated the numbers 3 times, knew the tensile strength of the cable, knew the load factors, knew the breaking point, knew this would work. It had to work. Installing it was harder. The space inside the boom was tight. McKenna worked with one hand while holding a flashlight with the other. His shoulder wedged against the boom structure. He could feel sweat running down his back despite the night air. His fingers cramped from the awkward position. The beam of the flashlight kept moving. Shadows jumped across the cable system. He disconnected the cable at the pulley junction, inserted the piano wire tensioner between the cable end and the pulley, reconnected the cable. The fit was tight. Had to force the clevis pin through. When it finally seated, he tested the tension by hand. No slack. The control surface moved immediately. Perfect. McKenna replaced the inspection panel, cleaned up his tools, walked out of the hangar at 0137 hours. His hands were shaking. Not from fear. From the realization that he'd just violated about 15 regulations, and if this failed, Morrison would crash, and McKenna would be responsible. He'd killed more pilots than he'd saved. But if it worked, maybe pilots would stop dying. Maybe Chen's death would mean something. Maybe the next 20 pilots would come home because one sergeant spent 8 minutes bending piano wire in a maintenance hangar. Morrison tested the modified aircraft the next morning. Standard training flight. Nothing aggressive. Just wanted to feel the difference. He taxied out at 0645. Took off. Climbed to 10,000 feet. The morning was clear. Perfect conditions for testing. He flew straight and level for 5 minutes. The aircraft felt normal, responsive. Nothing seemed different. Then he rolled the aircraft hard left. The response was instantaneous. No delay, no mushy feeling. The stick moved, and the aircraft rolled immediately. Morrison had been flying P-38 seconds for 8 months. He knew how they felt, knew the slight lag in control response, knew that fraction of a second where the aircraft seemed to think about your input before executing. But this was different. This was like someone had removed invisible weights from the control system. Like the aircraft had been waiting for his command and executed it the moment he gave it. He tried a hard right reversal, same instant response. Tried a series of rapid rolls. The aircraft snapped through each maneuver like it was part of his body instead of a machine he was controlling. He pulled into a steep climb, rolled inverted, pulled through into a split S. Every maneuver was crisp, immediate, precise. Morrison's heart was pounding. Not from exertion, from excitement, from the realization that McKenna had just given him an aircraft that could fight Zeros on more equal terms. He landed 20 minutes later, found McKenna in the maintenance area. "Do it to the other 3 aircraft in my flight," Morrison said. "Tonight. And don't tell anyone what you're doing." McKenna nodded. "Yes, sir. And Sergeant, you just saved lives. I don't know how many yet, but you saved lives. That's when Morrison started thinking about formations. See, fixing the control response solved one problem. The P-38 could now roll and maneuver faster, but it still couldn't outturn a Zero in a sustained turning fight. The Zero was lighter, more agile. Physics didn't care about cable tension. The Zero's wingspan was 36 feet. The P-38's was 52 feet. The Zero weighed 5,000 pounds. The P-38 weighed 17,000. The Zero could execute a full 360-degree turn in 14 seconds. The P-38 needed 24. No amount of cable tensioning would change that. Basic physics. But Morrison had heard stories from Navy pilots about something called the Thach weave, a tactical formation where two fighters protected each other by weaving back and forth. If an enemy committed to one fighter's tail, that fighter turned toward his wingman, and the wingman's guns were suddenly pointing at the enemy. Morrison had read the reports. Knew the Thach weave worked for Wildcats fighting Zeros. Commander John Thach had developed it early in the war, saved countless Navy pilots. But Wildcats were carrier-based Navy fighters. Different aircraft, different mission profile, different tactical doctrine. They were smaller, more maneuverable than P-38 seconds, could execute tighter turns. Nobody had tried adapting it for P-38 seconds. Morrison sat in his quarters one evening with a pack of matches. His wife had sent them in a care package, 20 wooden matches in a thin cardboard box. He'd been thinking about the Zero problem for weeks. The fundamental tactical challenge. How do you beat an enemy who can outturn you? How do you survive when the enemy is faster, more agile, and flown by pilots with 2 years of combat experience? He pulled out 4 matches, arranged them in a loose line formation. Standard P-38 doctrine was line abreast or finger 4 formation. Pilots stayed spread out, maintained visual contact, covered each other's blind spots. But when combat started, you fought independently. Every pilot for himself. Hit and run. Use speed and altitude. Dive in from above. Shoot. Climb back out. Never let the Zero dictate the terms of engagement. Except that doctrine kept getting pilots killed when Zeros reversed on them and they couldn't respond fast enough to escape. Morrison started moving the matches. What if 4 P-38 seconds didn't fight independently? What if they flew in 2 pairs, each pair executing a weaving pattern like the Navy's Thach weave? If a Zero committed to one P-38's tail, that P-38 would turn hard toward his wingman. Both aircraft would cross paths. The Zero following would suddenly have another P-38's guns pointing at him. The Zero pilot would have to choose, continue the tail chase and fly into the second P-38's guns, or break off the attack. But there was a problem. The Thach weave worked because Wildcats could turn tight enough to execute the crossing pattern before the enemy closed to firing range. P-38 seconds were heavy fighters, twin engines, twin booms. They turned wider and slower than Wildcats. By the time a P-38 completed a crossing turn, a Zero could close to firing range and shoot down the first aircraft before the wingman could bring guns to bear. Unless the controls responded faster, unless McKenna's modification gave P-38 seconds just enough extra roll rate to execute a modified weave pattern before Zeros could capitalize, if the P-38 could snap into the turn half a second faster, execute the roll half a second quicker, that might be enough. That fraction of a second could be the difference between the formation working and 4 dead pilots. Morrison moved the matches faster, trying different patterns. Not the tight weave that Wildcats used, something wider. Something that used the P-38's strengths, speed, and firepower while minimizing its weakness turn radius. Something that accepted the P-38 couldn't turn with a Zero, but could roll faster and had superior firepower. He called it the double scissors. 2 pairs of P-38 seconds, each pair executing alternating turns, not weaving continuously like Wildcats. Instead, one pair would cross while the other pair maintained altitude and speed. When the first pair completed their cross, the second pair would execute, like scissors opening and closing. Constant motion, constant mutual support. Always one pair in position to engage while the other pair maneuvered. If the controls responded fast enough, and with McKenna's modification, the formation could work. Morrison spent the next week training his flight on the double scissors, early morning flights before regular missions. They practiced the timing, practiced the turns, practiced trusting each other enough to fly within 200 feet while pulling hard G's and watching for zeros. It was dangerous. One mistake, one miscalculation, and two P-38 seconds would collide at 300 miles per hour. But dying in training was better than dying in combat. At least in training you could learn from mistakes. Hayes nearly collided with Chen on the second practice run. Both pilots broke hard when they realized they were closing too fast. The aircraft missed each other by maybe 50 feet. Morrison saw it happen from above. Felt his stomach clench. That was too close. One or both pilots could have died. Morrison called off the drill, brought everyone back to altitude. "Listen up," Morrison said over the radio. "This formation only works if you trust your wingman completely. If you trust that he's going to turn when you turn, cross when you cross, put his aircraft exactly where you need it. The moment you start second-guessing, the moment you start flying defensive, the formation breaks down and we're back to getting picked off individually. Hayes, Chen, you both broke because you didn't trust each other to hold the turn. If this happens in combat, we all die." They tried again. This time Hayes held his turn, trusted Chen. Chen held his turn, trusted Hayes. They crossed with exactly 200 feet separation. Perfect. Torres and Parker executed their cross. Perfect. They practiced for another hour. By the end of the session, all 4 pilots could execute the double scissors without radio calls. Just visual cues, reading each other's aircraft movements, anticipating the crosses, becoming a unit instead of 4 individuals. Morrison brought them back to Nadzab, called a debriefing in the ready room. "That's how we're gonna survive," he told his pilots. "Modified controls give us faster roll rate. Double scissors formation gives us mutual support. Together, it means zeros can't isolate us, can't get inside our turn radius, can't use their maneuverability advantage. We're changing the game from individual dogfighting to team tactics." "What about command?" Torres asked. "They're going to notice we're not flying standard formations. Someone's going to ask questions. Let them notice. After we prove it works. And if it doesn't work?" Parker asked. "If we die trying this, what happens to our families? What happens to the investigation?" Morrison looked at the 4 pilots sitting in front of him. Young men, good men, men who trusted him to keep them alive, men with families back home. Hayes had a girlfriend in Iowa. Chen had parents in Sacramento. Torres had a wife and baby daughter in Texas. Parker had a mother in Boston who'd already lost 1 son in North Africa. "Then I'll take the blame. I'll tell them I ordered you to fly the formation. I'll tell them the modifications were my idea. But gentlemen, I watched 6 pilots die in the past 2 months because doctrine said they couldn't turn with zeros and their aircraft couldn't respond fast enough to escape. I'm done watching good men die. We're trying something different." That was 3 weeks ago. Since then, Morrison's flight had flown 12 combat missions using the modified controls and double scissors formation. They'd engaged zeros 7 times, shot down 11 zeros, lost 0 aircraft, 0. Other squadrons were still losing pilots at the same rate they'd been losing them for months. 1.8 P-38 seconds lost for every 0 destroyed. But Morrison's flight kept coming home, kept racking up kills, kept proving that something was different. Their kill ratio was 11-0. Impossible odds turned into tactical victories. Word spread through the fighter groups. Pilots started asking Morrison what he was doing differently. Squadron commanders started noticing the kill ratios. The engineering officer at Nadzab started asking questions about control cable tensions, started noticing discrepancies in inspection reports, started wondering why Morrison's flight always showed perfect cable tension during inspections, but pilots reported improved control response. Morrison told them all the same thing. His pilots were just following doctrine more precisely. Better situational awareness, better discipline, better execution. That was a lie, and everyone knew it. But nobody pushed too hard Because Morrison's flight was getting results, and results were all that mattered in a combat zone where American pilots were outnumbered and outmaneuvered. Command looked the other way because dead pilots created paperwork and investigations. Living pilots created kill ratios and victory reports. Now, standing on the flight line at 0851 hours on October 24th, with 18 zeros inbound and 4 P-38 seconds to stop them, Morrison was about to find out if his matchstick wire trick could work against odds that should be impossible. If you're watching this and thinking about all the times you've had to figure something out on your own because the official way wasn't working, hit that like button right now. This story gets way more intense, and I need to know you're with me. Subscribe and turn on notifications because we're diving deep into forgotten World War II stories every single week. Stories about regular people who broke the rules to save lives. Real innovation, real courage. Drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from. Are you in Texas, North Carolina, California? I want to know who's part of this community. All right, let's get back to Morrison and his 4 pilots about to face impossible odds. The 4 P-38 seconds taxied out at 0856 hours. Morrison led Hayes on his right wing. Torres led the second element with Parker on his wing. They took off in pairs, climbed to 12,000 feet, headed northwest toward the intercept point. The morning was clear. Perfect visibility. Perfect conditions for a dog fight. Perfect conditions to die. The sky was that deep blue you only get in the tropics. No clouds, no haze. You could see for 30 miles in every direction, which meant the Zeros could see them coming, which meant surprise was impossible. Morrison's radio crackled. Ground control at Nadzab calling with an update. The Zero formation had split. 12 Zeros were heading for the convoy. 6 were circling at altitude, probably watching for American fighters, probably ready to bounce anyone who went after the main group. 18 versus 4 just became 12 versus 4, with 6 more waiting to pounce. Morrison keyed his radio. Here's how this works. We engage the 12 going after the convoy. Torres, you and Parker take the first element. Hayes and I will take the second. We execute standard double scissors. Watch for the 6 at altitude. When they commit, we go defensive and reverse the pattern. Copy, Torres replied. Copy, Hayes said. Parker's voice was tight. Copy. They saw the Zeros at 0913 hours. 12 aircraft in loose formation at 8,000 feet, heading southeast toward the convoy. The 6 high Zeros were at 15,000 feet, orbiting, watching. Morrison could see the sun glinting off their canopies. Beautiful aircraft, deadly aircraft, flown by pilots who'd been killing Americans for 2 years. Morrison calculated angles and speeds in his head. If they bounced the main group from altitude, the high Zeros would dive on them. If they tried to engage at co-altitude, they'd be outnumbered 3-1, with 6 more coming from above. No good options, just bad options and worse options. Morrison chose bad over worse. We're going high speed, low altitude, he called over the radio. Dive through the main group, kill what we can on the first pass, then execute the scissors pattern when they reverse on us. The high Zeros will dive, but we'll already be in the weave by then. They'll have to figure out where to commit, and that hesitation buys us time. Understood, Torres replied. Morrison pushed the throttles forward, dove toward the main Zero formation. His airspeed climbed, 300 miles per hour. 350, 400. The Zeros grew larger in his gun sight. He picked a target at the rear of the formation, got the Zero centered, pressed the trigger. 4 50 caliber machine guns and 1 20mm cannon hammered. Tracers reached out. Most missed. A few hits sparked off the Zero's wing, not enough damage. The Zero snap-rolled left and dove. Morrison rolled to follow. That's when he felt it. The instant response. No delay. His P-38 snapped through the roll like it was part of his body instead of a machine he was controlling. McKenna's modification working exactly as promised. He got his nose down. The Zero was right there. He fired again. 3-second burst. Rounds walked up the Zero's fuselage from tail to cockpit. The Zero's engine exploded. Pieces flew off. The aircraft rolled, inverted, and fell toward the jungle below, trailing black smoke. Morrison's first Zero kill. But there was no time to celebrate. The main Zero formation had scattered. Some dove, some climbed. Some reversed back toward Morrison's flight, and the 6 high Zeros were diving now, coming fast from 15,000 feet. "Double scissors," Morrison called. "Execute now." He turned hard toward Hayes. Hayes turned toward him. They crossed paths at 9,000 feet, with 3 Zeros diving on Morrison's tail. The lead Zero pilot committed to the tail chase, close to 600 yards. Then Hayes came screaming through the crossing pattern from the opposite direction. The Zero pilot suddenly had a new problem. He was chasing Morrison, but Morrison was flying directly toward another P-38, and that P-38's guns were pointing straight at him. Hayes opened fire at 400 yards. The Zero tried to break left, but Hayes anticipated the move, stayed on target, led the turn. The Zero's left wing shattered. The aircraft tumbled, fell. 2 kills in 30 seconds. Torres and Parker executed their cross. 2 Zeros had committed to Torres's tail, got within 400 yards. Then Parker came through the scissors pattern, and both Zeros flinched, pulled up, disengaged temporarily. The pattern was working. The Zeros couldn't commit to a tail chase without flying into another P-38's guns. And with the modified controls, Morrison's pilots could execute the crossing turns fast enough that the Zeros couldn't time the pattern, couldn't predict where the P-38 seconds would be, couldn't exploit the traditional P-38 weakness of slow roll rate. But the 6 high Zeros had arrived. They came in from above and behind, diving fast. Morrison saw them, called the warning. "High 6, diving from our 7 o'clock. Torres, break left and maintain the pattern. Hayes, stay with me." The high Zeros split their attack. 3 went after Morrison and Hayes. 3 went after Torres and Parker. They'd seen the scissors pattern, understood what Morrison's flight was doing, and they adapted. Instead of committing to individual tail chases, they attacked in coordinated pairs. 1 Zero would force a defensive turn, and his wingman would attack from a different angle. Classic bracket attack, designed to break formation integrity. This was new. This was Japanese pilots adapting to American tactics in real time. This was dangerous. Morrison rolled hard into the nearest Zero. Hayes stayed with him, executing the cross. The Zero reversed, tried to scissor back. Morrison stayed with him. The modified controls let him snap through the reversals fast enough that the Zero couldn't get separation. Every reversal, Morrison matched. Every turn, Morrison countered. The Zero's wingman tried to bracket from Morrison's left side, but Torres had seen the threat. He'd broken his own scissors pattern with Parker and dove toward Morrison's position. Came in on the Zero's 6 o'clock. Fired. Hit. The Zero's right wing root. The wing folded. The Zero spun down. 3 kills. But Parker was in trouble. Morrison heard him on the radio. "I've got 2 on my tail. Can't shake them. Controls are sluggish. Something's wrong." Something was wrong with Parker's aircraft. Maybe the modification had failed. Maybe a cable had snapped. Whatever the problem, Parker couldn't maneuver effectively, and 2 Zeros were closing on him. Morrison could see Parker's P-38 struggling through turns, see the aircraft lagging behind Parker's inputs. Morrison made a decision that violated every tactical principle in the book. He abandoned the scissors pattern with Hayes, dove toward Parker's position, came in from above, full throttle. The P-38's twin engines screamed. His airspeed climbed past 420 miles per hour, 500 yards from Parker. 400, 300. The 2 Zeros were within firing range of Parker now. Morrison saw tracer rounds reaching out, saw hits sparking off Parker's right boom, saw Parker's aircraft shuddering under the impacts. Morrison didn't have time for precision. He just fired. Full trigger pull, all guns. A sustained 10-second burst that emptied half his ammunition. The recoil made his aircraft shake. Spent brass casings tumbled away from his guns. The first Zero exploded, just disintegrated in midair. The second pulled up hard, tried to escape. Morrison stayed with him, fired again, more hits. The Zero's canopy shattered. The aircraft nosed over, crashed into the jungle. 5 kills. Morrison pulled up, looked for his flight. Hayes was still engaged with 2 Zeros, executing solo reversals, keeping them from committing. Torres was climbing back to altitude. Parker was limping toward home, his right engine trailing smoke, his right boom showing damage, and there were still 8 Zeros in the sky. Morrison keyed his radio. "Parker, get out of here. Head for Nadzab. Torres, escort him. Hayes, on me. We're gonna hold these. Zeros here until Parker's clear." "Copy," Torres replied. "What about us?" Hayes asked. "We're gonna keep them busy. Execute the scissors until Parker's out of range, then we run." "That's gonna be a long 4 minutes, sir." "I know, but it beats writing letters to Parker's mother." Morrison and Hayes reformed the scissors pattern. 2P, 38 seconds against 8 Zeros. The odds were suicide. But the modified controls gave them a chance, and the scissors pattern gave them mutual support, and Morrison was done losing pilots. The Zeros circled, looking for an opening. They'd learned from watching the first engagements. They weren't committing to individual attacks anymore. They were being patient, waiting for Morrison and Hayes to make a mistake, waiting for the P-38 seconds to run low on fuel, waiting for an opportunity. This was experienced Japanese pilots. This was pilots who'd survived 2 years of war. This was dangerous. Morrison checked his fuel gauge. 20 minutes left, maybe less. With the throttles pushed forward, they couldn't maintain this forever. 1 Zero broke from the formation, dove toward Hayes. Morrison called the warning. Hayes turned into the attack. Morrison crossed toward Hayes. The Zero broke off, climbed back to altitude. Another Zero tried from a different angle. Same result. The scissors pattern held. This went on for 3.5 minutes. 8 Zeros probing for weakness. 2 P-38 seconds holding formation. Nobody scoring hits. Nobody taking damage. Just a deadly dance at 12,000 feet while Parker and Torres headed for safety. Finally, Torres's voice crackled over the radio. "Parker's clear. You're good to break." "Copy," Morrison replied. "Hayes, on my mark, we brake hard left and dive for the deck. Full throttle. Don't look back. Just run." "Understood." 3, 2, 1. Mark. Both P-38 seconds broke left simultaneously, pushed their noses down. Dove. The Zeros followed. But the P-38 seconds had a head start and superior straight line. Speed. At 420 miles per hour, the Lightnings pulled away from the Zeros. The Japanese pilots chased for maybe 2 minutes, then broke off. They'd lost 5 aircraft. They weren't going to risk losing more chasing P-38 seconds that could outrun them in straight-line speed. Morrison and Hayes leveled out at 2,000 feet, headed southeast toward Nadzab. Morrison checked his fuel. 8 minutes left. They'd make it. Barely. His hands were shaking on the control stick. Adrenaline leaving his system. Exhaustion setting in. They landed at Nadzab at 1,004 hours. Parker was already on the ground, maintenance crew inspecting his damaged aircraft. Torres was in the debriefing room, filling out combat reports. Morrison shut down his engines, climbed out of the cockpit. His hands were shaking. His flight suit was soaked with sweat. He'd just led 4 P-38 seconds against 18 Zeros and brought all 4 pilots home alive. 5 Zero kills confirmed. 0 friendly losses. McKenna was waiting on the flight line, his face anxious. "How'd the controls feel?" he asked. Morrison looked at the sergeant, saw the grease stains on his coveralls, saw the worry in his eyes, saw a man who'd violated regulations because he knew it was the right thing to do. "Saved our lives," Morrison said. "Every one of us should be dead right now. But your modification gave us just enough extra response to make the scissors work. We engaged 18 Zeros, shot down 5, lost 0 aircraft. Your 8 minutes of work saved 4 lives today, Sergeant." McKenna nodded slowly. "Parker's right," aileron cable snapped. "The modification didn't cause it. Cable was already frayed. Just happened to fail during the engagement. I'll replace it, retension it, have him back in the air tomorrow." "Do that. And McKenna?" Start modifying every P-38 at this airfield. I don't care if command approves it or not. I'm done losing pilots because their aircraft can't respond fast enough." "Yes, sir." Morrison walked to the debriefing room. His 4 pilots were there: Hayes, Torres, Parker, Chen, all alive, all intact. Parker had a cut on his forehead from where debris had come through his canopy, but he was alive. "Gentlemen," Morrison said, "what we did today was impossible. 18 zeros should have killed us all, but we had 3 advantages: modified controls that let us maneuver faster, a formation that provided mutual support, and trust in each other." He paused, looked at each pilot. "Command's going to hear about this engagement. They're going to ask questions. They're going to want to know how 4 P-38 seconds survived 18 zeros. When they ask, tell them the truth. Tell them about the modified controls. Tell them about the double scissors formation. Tell them we violated doctrine because doctrine was getting pilots killed. They might court-martial us," Torres said. "Maybe. But I'd rather face a court-martial than write another letter to another mother explaining how her son followed orders and died anyway. We proved today that there's a better way. Now, we make command listen." Parker spoke up, his voice quiet. "My cable snapped, sir. If McKenna hadn't modified my aircraft, I'd be dead. That modification bought me just enough extra control authority to survive until the cable failed. Without it, I wouldn't have made it back. I'd be in the jungle right now, dead or captured." Morrison nodded. "Then we owe McKenna our lives. And we owe it to every other P-38 pilot in this theater to share what we learned." The story of Morrison's engagement spread through 5th Air Force in 48 hours. 4 P-38 seconds versus 18 zeros. 5 kills, 0 losses. Pilots wanted to know how. Squadron commanders wanted to know why Morrison's flight kept coming home when other flights kept losing aircraft. The statistics were impossible to ignore. The engineering officer at Nadzab filed a report. Noted inconsistent cable tensions on Morrison's flight aircraft. Noted unauthorized modifications. Recommended investigation. The report sat on desks for 2 weeks while officers debated what to do. The modifications violated regulations, but they worked. Morrison's flight had the best kill-to-loss ratio in the Southwest Pacific. His pilots were surviving, and survival statistics mattered more than regulations when you were losing the air war. In November, a team from Lockheed arrived at Nadzab to evaluate McKenna's modification. They tested it, measured cable tension, calculated stress loads, ran flight tests, flew modified and unmodified aircraft back to back. Their conclusion? The modification was safe and effective, should have been part of the original design. The engineers admitted they'd missed this in the initial testing phase. Lockheed integrated a similar tensioning system into the P-38J model that entered production in December 1943. But McKenna never received official credit. No commendation, no medal. The official documentation attributed the improvement to engineering analysis. McKenna's name didn't appear anywhere in the official record. Morrison received a Distinguished Flying Cross for the October 24th engagement. The citation mentioned his tactical innovation and exceptional leadership. It didn't mention the modified controls, didn't mention that he'd violated regulations to save lives. If you're still with me, take a second and hit that subscribe button. We're halfway through this story, and it only gets more intense from here. Stories like Morrison's and McKenna's deserve to be remembered. They show what real innovation looks like when the stakes are life and death. Subscribe if you like what you're hearing. We're building a community that cares about these forgotten heroes. Now let's talk about what happened when the Japanese figured out what Morrison was doing. Japanese intelligence noticed the change in November 1943. Flight reports from the 11th Air Fleet mentioned that American P-38 seconds were maneuvering more aggressively, rolling faster into turns, executing coordinated patterns that made them difficult to isolate and attack. Lieutenant Commander Saburo Sakai was one of Japan's top aces, 64 confirmed kills. He'd been fighting American pilots since Pearl Harbor. He'd survived being shot down twice. He'd seen the war shift from Japanese dominance to American recovery. On November 17th, Sakai engaged Morrison's flight over Wewak. Sakai used his standard tactic, drew Morrison into a turning fight, waited for the P-38 to begin its roll, then snapped his turn back the opposite direction to get inside Morrison's turning radius. He'd done this maneuver hundreds of times, against Wildcats, against P-39 seconds, against P-40 seconds, always worked. The American would commit to a turn, and Sakai would reverse direction faster than the American could follow, except Morrison reversed with him. Sakai had executed this maneuver dozens of times, knew exactly how long it took a P-38 to roll, knew the timing perfectly, could predict to the fraction of a second when the American pilot would complete the roll and try to reverse direction. But Morrison's P-38 rolled faster than it should have, and instead of fighting alone, Morrison turned directly toward another P-38, executing a crossing pattern. Sakai found himself flying between two P-38 seconds, both with guns pointing at him. He had to brake hard right, dive away. For the first time in his combat career, Sakai had been forced to disengage from a P-38. He'd always been the hunter. Now he was prey. He returned to base confused and frustrated. Wrote a report describing the encounter. Noted that American P-38 seconds appeared to have improved control response. Noted the coordinated crossing pattern. Recommended caution when engaging P-38 seconds operating in pairs. His report was filed with dozens of other reports from experienced Japanese pilots describing similar encounters. Other experienced Japanese pilots reported similar encounters. The Americans weren't flying different aircraft. They weren't using different weapons. But something had changed. Something that disrupted the tactics Japanese pilots had been using successfully for months. Something invisible but deadly. Japanese intelligence examined wreckage from downed P-38 seconds. Found no obvious modifications. The aircraft looked identical to the ones they'd been fighting. The engines were the same. The armament was the same. Nothing visible had changed. They didn't know about the 6-inch piece of piano wire hidden inside the boom. Didn't know about McKenna working alone in the maintenance hangar. Didn't know about Morrison's matchstick formation planning. The modification was so simple, so subtle, that even careful examination didn't reveal it. By December, Japanese pilots were losing aircraft to P-38 seconds at rates they hadn't seen since early in the war. The psychological impact was significant. 0 pilots had owned the sky in turning fights for 2 years. They knew they could outmaneuver anything the Americans flew. That confidence was breaking down. Morale was deteriorating. Pilots who used to press attacks were becoming cautious, hesitant. They weren't sure anymore if their tactics would work, and hesitation in air combat gets you killed faster than bad tactics. Second-guessing yourself at 300 miles per hour is a death sentence. The Japanese tried to adapt. Some pilots stopped trying to get into turning fights with P-38 seconds, used hit-and-run tactics instead, but that meant giving up their main advantage. The Zero's strength was maneuverability. Fighting like a P-38 meant fighting on American terms, and the P-38 was faster, more heavily armed, and could take more damage. Other pilots tried to compensate by being more aggressive, closing to shorter range before firing, taking more risks. But aggression without the ability to predict the enemy's response just meant dying faster, several experienced. Japanese pilots were killed in December trying tactics that had worked perfectly in July. Pilots with dozens of kills, pilots who'd survived years of combat, all killed by an enemy they couldn't understand. The fundamental problem for Japanese pilots was that they were fighting an enemy they couldn't see. They knew something had changed, but they didn't know what. And you can't develop counter-tactics against a modification you don't know exists. You can't adapt to an invisible enemy. Back at Nadzab, McKenna had modified 42 P-38 seconds by December 15th. Word had spread pilot to pilot, mechanic to mechanic. No official documentation, no engineering approval. Just whispered conversations in ready rooms and maintenance areas. McKenna had become a legend among the mechanics, the guy who'd figured out what Lockheed's engineers had missed. Crew chiefs in other squadrons asked McKenna to show them how. He did. Cut the piano wire, bend it into a Z shape, install it as an inline tensioner. Takes 8 minutes, changes everything. He trained 17 other mechanics in the modification. Each of them trained others. The knowledge spread like wildfire. The modifications spread through the 5th Air Force like wildfire. By January 1944, maybe 120 P-38 seconds in the Southwest Pacific had the modification. The kill ratio started shifting dramatically. In July, American pilots lost 2 P-38 seconds for every 0 destroyed. By January, it was 3 zeros destroyed for every P-38 lost. The tide was turning. Something had changed. But officially, nobody knew what. Command didn't want to know. Plausible deniability. If something went wrong, they could claim ignorance. Morrison's double scissors formation spread even faster than the mechanical modification. Pilots saw it work. Saw 4 P-38 seconds survive impossible odds. Wanted to learn it. Morrison spent 3 weeks in December traveling to different airfields, teaching the formation. He'd gather pilots in ready rooms, pull out matches, show them the crossing pattern, explain the timing, explain the trust required, explain how 2 aircraft could protect each other better than 4 aircraft fighting independently. Some pilots understood immediately. Others needed days of practice. But everyone who learned it came back from missions alive more often. The statistics were undeniable. By February 1944, the double scissors was semi-official doctrine for P-38 operations in the Southwest Pacific. Command still hadn't formally approved it. Still had questions about how it deviated from standard tactical doctrine, but they couldn't argue with the results. Pilots were coming home. That was all that mattered. Morrison's original 4 pilots became instructors. Hayes taught the formation at Port Moresby. Torres taught it at Gusap. Parker taught it at Nadzab. Chen had been killed in December not because the formation failed, but because engine failure forced him to crash land in the jungle, and he died before rescue arrived. Malaria got him before the Japanese did. But even Chen's death didn't diminish the tactical value of what Morrison had developed. The war continued. Morrison flew 63 combat missions, shot down 14 Japanese aircraft, survived multiple close calls, survived being shot down once, spent 3 days in the jungle before being rescued, returned to the States in March 1945, married his high school sweetheart, had 3 children, worked as a flight instructor after the war, taught tactical formations to new pilots, always started his instruction the same way, pulling out matches and showing students how innovation saves lives. McKenna stayed in the Army Air Force until 1946, returned to California, went back to working on cars, opened his own garage in Long Beach in 1948, worked on engines for 42 years, never talked much about the war. When people asked, he'd say he was a mechanic, fixed airplanes. That's all. He didn't mention the lives he'd saved, didn't mention that his 8 minutes of work had changed aerial warfare in the Pacific. In 1991, a military historian researching P-38 modifications found references to piano wire tensioners in maintenance logs from New Guinea. The historian tracked down McKenna through veteran registries. McKenna was 73 years old by then, still working part-time in his garage, still fixing engines, still using the same careful, methodical approach he'd used on P-38 seconds 50 years earlier. The historian asked about the modification. McKenna confirmed the story, said it wasn't anything special, just something that needed doing. The historian estimated that the modification may have saved between 80 and 100 American pilots' lives based on survival rate improvements in squadrons that used it, maybe more. The exact number was impossible to calculate, but the improvement in kill ratios and survival statistics was measurable and significant. McKenna said he never counted. He just remembered the pilots who came back. That's what mattered. Not the numbers, not the statistics. The faces of the pilots who climbed out of their cockpits and lived another day. Morrison died in 2003 at age 87. His obituary in the Los Angeles Times mentioned his Distinguished Flying Cross. mentioned his service as a P-38 pilot, mentioned that he'd shot down 14 Japanese aircraft. It didn't mention the matches, didn't mention the piano wire, didn't mention that he'd combined a mechanic's unauthorized modification with a tactical innovation that changed how American fighters flew. McKenna died in 2006 at age 88. His obituary mentioned his service in World War II as an aircraft mechanic. It didn't mention the piano wire tensioner, didn't mention that he'd violated regulations to save lives, didn't mention that his innovation had been incorporated into every P-38J that rolled off the assembly line. But here's what both obituaries missed. Here's what the official histories don't tell you. Innovation in combat doesn't come from engineering committees or tactical manuals. It comes from people desperate enough to break rules and brave enough to try something different. It comes from sergeants and majors who see problems and fix them, who accept personal risk because saving lives matters more than following regulations. Morrison saw pilots dying and refused to accept that doctrine was infallible. McKenna saw a mechanical problem and fixed it, even though fixing it could have gotten him court-martialed. Together, they saved lives, changed tactics, proved that sometimes the best solutions come from the bottom up, not the top down. The P-38 Lightning went on to become one of America's most successful fighters in the Pacific. The official history credits improved pilot training and tactical development. But talk to the pilots who flew them. Talk to the mechanics who maintained them. They'll tell you about the piano wire tensioners. They'll tell you about the double scissors formation. They'll tell you about Morrison and McKenna. Today, modern fighter tactics still use variations of the double scissors. F-15 seconds and F-16 seconds execute crossing patterns for mutual support. F-22 seconds and F-35 seconds use the same principle of two aircraft protecting each other. The principle never changed. Two aircraft protecting each other, turning toward each other, surviving together. The technology changed. The principle didn't. The matches Morrison used to visualize the formation are preserved at the National Museum of the Pacific War in Fredericksburg, Texas. They're in a glass case next to a piece of piano wire donated by McKenna's family. The placard says, "Innovation in combat often comes from unexpected sources. These simple objects represent tactical and mechanical innovations that saved American lives during World War II." School groups walk past that case every day. Most don't stop, but pilots always stop. They look at those matches and that piece of wire. They understand. If this story moved you the way it moved me, I need you to do something. Hit that subscribe button right now. These stories deserve to be remembered. Morrison and McKenna deserve to be remembered. Every week I'm digging through archives, finding forgotten heroes, sharing their stories. But I can't do it without you. Subscribe, turn on notifications, drop a comment, and tell me you're here. Tell me where you're watching from. Tell me if someone in your family served. Just let me know you care about keeping these memories alive. Let me tell you about one more mission, one more story that shows why Morrison's innovation mattered. March 12, 1944, 3 months after Morrison returned to the States. His original flight, minus Chen, was still flying combat missions out of Nadzab, Hayes, Torres, and Parker. They'd trained new pilots to fill out the 4-ship formation. Lieutenant Michael Santos from New Mexico and Lieutenant Robert Williams from Georgia. They launched at 0730 hours on a fighter sweep over Wewak. Intelligence reported 24 Zeros operating in the area. The mission was simple: find them, engage them, clear the airspace for an incoming bomber strike. They found the Zeros at 0814 hours, 24 aircraft in 3 formations of 8, standard Japanese tactical spread. Hayes was leading Morrison's old flight. He looked at the odds: 4 P-38 seconds against 24 Zeros, 6-1. 5 years earlier, those odds would have been a death sentence. Standard doctrine would have said disengage, call for support, don't commit. But Hayes had learned from Morrison, had seen the double scissors work against impossible odds, had survived because of McKenna's modification. But Hayes remembered Morrison's words from that October morning in 1943. Trust the modification. Trust the formation. Trust each other. Hayes keyed his radio. We're engaging. Double scissors. Standard cross pattern. Santos and Williams, you're with Torres. Execute on my mark. They dove toward the nearest formation of 8 zeros. The modified controls responded instantly. Hayes rolled hard, picked a target, fired. The 0 exploded. Torres got another. Parker scored hits on a third. The zeros scattered, then reformed. Tried to bracket Hayes's flight. Tried to isolate individual P-38 seconds. Tried the tactics that had worked for 2 years. But every time a 0 committed to a tail chase, the targeted P-38 turned toward his wingman. The scissors pattern held. The zeros couldn't time it. Couldn't predict where the P-38 seconds would be. Couldn't commit without flying into another P-38's guns. The engagement lasted 14 minutes. When it ended, Hayes's flight had shot down 8 zeros, damaged 3 more, lost 0 aircraft. All 4 P-38 seconds returned to Nadzab with minor damage and nearly empty ammunition. Hayes filed his combat report that afternoon. The kill ratio was 8-0. The tactic was Morrison's double scissors combined with McKenna's control modifications. The result was 4 pilots coming home alive when they should have been outnumbered and overwhelmed. The report went up the chain of command, reached 5th Air Force Headquarters, reached General Kenny, commander of Allied Air Forces in the Southwest Pacific. Kenny read the report, read the statistics. 8 kills, 0 losses, 4 against 24. He'd been watching these statistics for months, had seen the kill ratios shift, had heard the rumors about unauthorized modifications, had looked the other way because pilots were surviving. On March 20th, General Kenny issued an official directive. All P-38 squadrons in the Southwest Pacific would adopt the double scissors formation as standard tactical doctrine. All maintenance crews would implement improved aileron cable tensioning per specifications developed by Lockheed based on field modifications. Morrison's Matchstick formation and McKenna's piano wire modification became official 2 years after they'd first violated regulations to save lives. But here's the thing that gets me about this story. Morrison and McKenna never asked permission. They saw a problem. They fixed it. They accepted the risk of court-martial because they knew pilots were dying and they had a solution. They chose action over caution, results over regulations, lives over careers. That's real leadership. Not waiting for approval, not following broken doctrine because it's official, seeing what needs to be done and doing it, even when it means breaking rules. How many times in your life have you seen something that needed fixing, seen a better way to do things, seen people suffering because that's just how we do it? And how many times did you stay quiet because speaking up meant risking your job, your reputation, your career? How many times did you see the right answer but chose the safe answer instead? Morrison and McKenna risked everything. Court-martial, dishonorable discharge, prison. They risked it all because saving lives mattered more than following regulations. Because doing the right thing mattered more than protecting their careers. That's the lesson here. Innovation doesn't come from committees. It comes from people willing to take risks, willing to trust their judgment, willing to act when everyone else is waiting for permission. Innovation comes from people who see the gap between doctrine and reality and decide to close that gap. Regulations be damned. The P-38 pilots who survived the war because of Morrison's formation and McKenna's modification, over 200 pilots, according to post-war analysis, they went home, got married, had families, built careers, lived full lives. All because 2 men refused to accept that this is just how things are. Think about that. 200 men who should have died but didn't. 200 families who got their sons, brothers, and husbands back. 200 lives that continued because Morrison picked up matches and McKenna bent piano wire. 200 Christmas dinners. 200 wedding anniversaries. 200 grandchildren who exist because their grandfather survived the war. That's the real impact of innovation. Not statistics, not kill ratios. Lives lived. And nobody knew their names until a historian dug through maintenance logs 50 years later. That's the tragedy and the triumph of war. The tragedy is that most innovation happens in desperation. The triumph is that some people refuse to accept unnecessary death. The tragedy is that most heroes go unrecognized. The triumph is that their actions matter regardless of recognition. Morrison and McKenna weren't unique. There were hundreds of mechanics and pilots throughout World War II who saw problems and fixed them, who violated regulations to save lives, who innovated in maintenance hangars, cockpits, because waiting for official approval meant watching people die. Most of their names are forgotten. Most of their innovations went undocumented. Most of their violations were covered up or ignored because command knew that sometimes the best solutions come from the people actually doing the work. But the ones we do know about Morrison's formation, McKenna's modification, Fox weave, countless others, they remind us that real innovation happens at the edge, where doctrine meets reality, where theory meets practice, where somebody says there has to be a better way and risks everything to prove it. So here's what I want you to take away from this story. Next time you see a problem that everyone says can't be solved, remember Morrison and his matches. Next time you know there's a better way but you're told to follow the rules, remember McKenna and his piano wire. Next time you have to choose between doing what's safe and doing what's right, remember that 200 pilots came home because 2 men chose right over safe. The war ended in August 1945. Morrison was stateside, teaching new pilots. McKenna was still in the Pacific, maintaining aircraft. They saw each other one more time before McKenna shipped home in October. They met at a bar in Brisbane, had a few drinks, didn't talk much about the war, mostly talked about going home, about what they'd do next. Morrison wanted to keep flying. McKenna wanted to work on cars, normal lives, peaceful lives. Before they parted ways, Morrison said something that McKenna remembered for the rest of his life. "You know how many pilots you saved with that piano wire trick?" McKenna shrugged. "I never counted." "I did," Morrison said. "At least 200, probably more. That's 200 men going home because you spent 8 minutes in a maintenance hangar doing something you weren't supposed to do. 200 families getting their sons back. That matters, Sergeant. That matters more than any medal or commendation. You saved lives." McKenna was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "So did you, sir. You were the one who asked me to do it. You were the one who risked the court-martial. You were the one who figured out how to use it tactically. I just bent wire. You saved the lives." Morrison smiled. "Then I guess we both did. And that's how it's supposed to work. Enlisted men and officers, mechanics and pilots, all trying to solve the same problem. Keep people alive. That's the only mission that matters." They finished their drinks, shook hands, went their separate ways. Morrison became a civilian flight instructor. McKenna opened his garage. They stayed in touch for a few years, but eventually lost contact the way veterans often do. Life moves on. The war becomes history. Memories fade, but the lessons remain. But every August 17th, the anniversary of Morrison's first mission with modified controls, Morrison would raise a glass in his garage back in California and toast to a sergeant he'd asked to break regulations. And every August 17th, McKenna would raise a glass in his garage in Long Beach and toast to a major who'd trusted him to fix what the engineers couldn't. They never saw each other again after Brisbane, but they never forgot what they'd accomplished together. Never forgot that 8 minutes of work and 2 matches had changed the course of aerial warfare in the Pacific. If you've made it this far, you're part of something special. You're part of keeping these stories alive. Hit that subscribe button if you haven't already. We're building a community that cares about forgotten heroes, real people who did extraordinary things. Like this video if it moved you. Share it with someone who needs to hear about Morrison and McKenna. Drop a comment and let me know you're here. Tell me where you're watching from. Tell me if this story affected you. Tell me if you know a Morrison or McKenna in your own life. Someone who broke rules to do what was right. These stories matter. These men matter, and you matter, for taking the time to listen. Thank you for being here. Thank you for caring. And thank you for helping make sure that Morrison's matches and McKenna's piano wire don't disappear into forgotten history. Because when we forget the innovators, when we forget the people who broke rules to save lives, we lose something essential about what makes us human. We lose the knowledge that doing the right thing sometimes means breaking the rules. We lose the understanding that real leadership comes from the bottom up as much as the top down. We lose the example of courage that every generation needs to see. So remember Morrison, remember McKenna, remember the 200 pilots who came home, and the next time you face a choice between doing what's safe and doing what's right, remember that 2 matches and a piece of piano wire changed the war. Remember that innovation comes from people who refuse to accept unnecessary death. Remember that heroes don't always wear medals. Sometimes they wear grease-stained coveralls and carry pliers. Sometimes they sit in ready rooms with matches, trying to figure out how to keep their people alive. That's the real story of World War II. Not just the big battles and famous generals, but the sergeants and majors, the mechanics and pilots, the people who saw problems and fixed them, who broke rules to save lives, who changed the world 8 minutes at a time. Thank you for listening. Thank you for remembering. And thank you for being part of keeping these stories alive.